Well, hello everyone, and thanks to all the people who've given presentations this afternoon and also during the course of the event. I think Mel's talk there really was setting the scene really well for a discussion that, judging by the number of questions that have been coming in and are being voted for as we speak, will be quite a lively one. And in fact, I'm not sure even now that we'll be able to get through all those questions in the time that's available. But anyway, it's possible, as you know, to vote for the different questions, and this feels like introducing the top 20 or something like that. But coming in really at number one was a joint number one, but quite a nice one to start with, and I think this might be a good one to pass over to Mel. It says, given that the colour of squirrels can be quite variable, do you ever get confusion about whether the public are reporting a red or a grey squirrel?
Absolutely, we do. And funny enough, I was just chatting about this before we came on air, as it were. Yes, because we do get very red-looking grey squirrels and very grey-looking red squirrels. So the way we tend to verify is if a red squirrel is turning up in an area where red squirrels are fairly commonplace, it doesn't feel like it's going to make too much if it's the wrong color squirrel. Somebody said it's a red squirrel and it's not. It doesn't make too much difference. We know there are red squirrels anyway. If we've got an extra dot on the map, it's not too much of an issue. And likewise, grey squirrels. It's just when they turn up in the wrong place or somewhere a little bit unexpected. And I tend to verify the sightings that are in the central lowlands, central belt rather, the Lothians in particular. And there are still red squirrels around. Not many, and it's really exciting. If somebody does report one, you think, "Ooh, wonder if it's real." And you can sometimes get them to send you an image. And for anybody listening, images are so useful. If you can get an image, send us an image. If it's anything that's within doubt, send us an image, because it really helps. It means that we then don't have to email you or phone you up and ask you annoying questions about whether it really was a red or grey squirrel. But that's what we do. If there's something doubtful, we'll get in contact with the recorder and say, well, are you sure it couldn't have been a red-looking grey squirrel? And we take them through the identification features of the two species, and sometimes they'll say, oh, it might have been a grey squirrel after all, or it might have been a red squirrel after all. I'm dying for it to be a red squirrel in Edinburgh, but I do get reports of red squirrels in Edinburgh quite a lot.
Thanks very much, Mel. I'm sort of reminded in a different way, and it's not to do with reds and greys, that there's still really maybe a little bit of a question mark about, did Strathspey red squirrels, for example, ever completely die out? Because actually, once they're really, really thin in the ground, that's a slightly different thing from colour. So I'm digressing already, so I'll move over. The next question's one for Nicole, which somebody's wondering whether or how they can get hold of SSRS data for research purposes.
So you just need to get in touch with us, let us know who you are and what organisation you're doing research with, what data you want access to and how you'll be using that data. And then we take that information and draw up a data agreement, send it off to you for review, and once you've signed it, we can release the data to you. If you're just wanting squirrel occurrence records and not kind of trapping details, then you can download those from the NBN.
It's certainly really impressive, the amount of data that's been pulled together. And in your talks this afternoon, I mean, it's a bit ironic as a writer. I still love, good graphics of things. So once you've got some really good dot maps and things coming in, it's great seeing the patterns of data that you've been pulling together there. It's I shouldn't say that a picture is worth 1,000 words or I'll be putting myself out of business, but the two combined can be really, really good. There's another one for Mel here, someone wondering if you can elaborate on your remarks at the start of the DCA talk regarding SSRS help and support after March 2022. You were saying some things earlier, but I don't know, maybe there's something you could add to that, Mel.
There isn't a lot I can actually say at the moment, unfortunately. We've really only just before the conference got final confirmation through that we have the funding necessary for the following phase, but we don't yet know what that looks like. We've still got a funding shortfall, but the trust has taken the decision that they will underwrite the funding shortfall for now, and in the hope that we can fundraise against it. So we are going ahead, but we don't quite know exactly what that looks like. And so until we do, there's nothing, I can't really elaborate very much, but it will, the idea is that something will happen, as I'm sure I've said to people before, something will happen in all three of the main areas, the Northeast, Highland Line and the South, but quite exactly what remains to be seen. It's going to be budget dependent.
Yeah, and I guess this probably overlaps with the next question voted for on the list. It's kind of an aspect of the same thing there, and it may need to be a similar question, which is, will SWT always be the lead for red squirrel projects? I mean, again, maybe it's yourself, Mel, but anybody else SWT linked? I don't want to put Joe in the spot here, but it's kind of related to what you just said, I guess.
I think the way the project came about, the trust was to run the project until we got to a point where we knew whether grey squirrel control was a viable way of protecting red squirrels, and whether our strategy, to try and protect this big red only population was the right one, and whether we could actually do this. And I feel the trust has now run several projects back to back, and we have shown, I think without a doubt, this can do what we need to do. I don't think the aspiration when we started, or anybody's expectation, was that the trust would always be the people delivering it. But I'm sure there's always going to be a role that, red squirrels are, as people keep saying over and over, people love the things, they're absolutely passionate about them. They'll sell anything. And I, for one, will be as a member of the trust, as well as a member of staff, I'm an active subscribing member, I will be really cross if they keep using red squirrel images and they aren't actually doing something for red squirrels. So I would hope there would always be some involvement. But, to secure this kind of thing over the long term, we need some, the trust is a charity. We're reliant on who donates what on a year-to-year basis. There needs to be some way of funding this. It's built into somebody's job role where we don't have to keep wondering whether we can keep staff on or let them go. It needs a more permanent way of delivering this, basically.
Kenny, can I just come in on that, if that's okay?
Yeah.
I think it's probably worth saying that, Saving Scotland's Red Squirrels is one of a number of dedicated projects that are looking at invasive non-native species, which are being funded in a similar way with lead bodies and periodic grant applications. And as Mel says, it's probably key that we have a coordinating body and we have some dedicated professional support. But there is a need to sort of mainstream this activity and make it, a core part of our sort of collective delivery if we really want to address biodiversity loss and climate crisis and the biodiversity crisis. So I see longer term, we will be developing a new Scottish biodiversity strategy, which will be due for consultation next year. And I think invasive non-native species and the long-term management of that will be absolutely key and a key strand of that. And I think it's something, it would be really good if the people here today engage in that, emphasize the importance of this activity and the importance of some formal and embedded funding in a range of different ways, either through that agri-environment scheme. There are different mechanisms that are used in other countries. So I think we're hopefully at a point where we might move to a more sustainable or hybrid kind of approach longer term. But there's no doubt the work SWT has done in being the hub has been absolutely critical to get us to this stage.
Thanks, Eileen. And actually, the next question, which is partly directed at Mel, but I think I'll put it to you first, Eileen, is quite relevant to NatureScot and to your role within it. So somebody's been asking, as more rewilding takes place, which is so urgent for climate and nature emergencies, more habitat that suits all species, including greys, is likely to be created. The questioner imagines this is likely to have a bearing on future needs, specifically for the project, but it's a wider pan-Scottish issue, if you like. So I wonder, first off, Eileen, and then maybe Mel, or if anybody else wants to chip in, please do, what you think about that there could be almost conflicting interests here.
Yeah, it's a really interesting question, and it is something that there has been some modelling done, particularly in the Cairngorms National Park, because they have strong aspirations to increase the area of woodland and achieve connectivity, because that's beneficial for many species. But we are obviously need to think through what are the implications for sort of enabling greys and others to travel. So I don't think there's an easy answer. I mean, I think in the longer term we'd like some of that rewilding to be a little bit more targeted and directed. So if you had a kind of big map of Scotland and you said these are the absolute hot spots where we think connectivity is important, but at the moment the rewilding is largely kind of bottom up and being developed through individual initiatives, and I think that does pose a bit of a risk for some of the work that we're doing and INS more generally, where we might inadvertently be enabling the kind of spread. So I don't think there's an obvious answer to that, but I think it's something that we need to increasingly have in our minds.
Do you want to add anything to that, Mel or Gill?
I would say, well, I'm a member of the Scottish Wildlife Trust, and I would support the planting of native woodland for all sorts of other reasons. Although squirrels is my job, I would like to support all native wildlife. And so one of the great things about getting rid of grey squirrels from a landscape is it then doesn't sort of matter that you've got some of these grey squirrel favoured types of woodland. You can move away from having to cut down all your beech trees and what have you. But as Eileen said, it's going to be a balancing thing. One of the things that came out of the Trees for Life talk is that these new plantations in the west of Scotland are not connected, and so they are ultimately island strongholds. Well, it turned out to be not as islandy as we thought, because the red squirrels can gallivant over tens of miles of countryside, but which begs the question, can't grey squirrels do that as well? But they are a long way from where grey squirrels are, and so you wouldn't immediately want to just connect those up with lovely grey squirrel habitat, would you? So I don't know, it needs thinking about. But you can plant a lot of native broadleaves that are not that interesting to grey squirrels, or actually red squirrels either. But for instance, I don't know, aspen and birch and I'm trying to think of what the other ones are, but there's alder, and those kind of things are not particularly useful to squirrels. So there are things that you can plant that was good for other wildlife, that it doesn't have to be oak and certainly not beech, because obviously that's not a native, but I have a soft spot for hazel. I would always plant a hazel.
And beavers have a soft spot for aspen, so a lot more aspen planting would be quite beneficial now that things have changed at a national level as well in terms of aspects of thinking about beavers. Trees for Life you mentioned there, and someone's thinking, Jill, what the potential is for further kind of joint running or partnership with bodies such as Trees for Life.
Yeah, I think this is about specifically the Great Scottish Squirrel Survey, and like kind of what I was saying in my presentation about how it would be great if this campaign could continue in the future, and who would run it, who would be involved. And actually, after the first year that we ran it, I was in talks with Trees for Life with Becky Priestley, who is their main red squirrel woman, about kind of trying to team up a bit more and make it a joint campaign. And then the following year, I was on maternity leave and there was all the uncertainty around COVID. And then this year, Becky was on maternity leave. So we've never quite managed to kind of align as such, but definitely, I think there still is that interest. And, if even beyond SSRS, if the Scottish Wildlife Trust was to continue with this campaign, it would be great to get other people more actively involved with it. Trees for Life. There was also talk about, UK Squirrel Concord or Red Squirrel Survival Trust, maybe potentially making it the Great British squirrel survey, who knows? But yeah, I think it just, I mean, obviously when we've been running it, like I said, you know, it's kind of been quite organic in a sense. We've not had a huge budget for things like advertising and things. It's been quite DIY, and we've still managed to get quite a reasonable turnout. I guess the question you need to ask is, what are we doing with those squirrel sightings? You know, is the data actually getting used, you know, beyond SSRS? But if that was still the case, I think it's, you know, I think it's got massive potential as a campaign.
Great. Another one about appearance. It's got a couple of votes here. So I don't know, maybe Nicole or Mel, this would be something for you. So as well as white squirrels, have there been any reports of black, i.e. kind of melanistic squirrels sent in? Are you aware of that same call?
Less common, but I'm sure I remember in a previous phase of SSRS, we had a newsletter that had the lovely title, or at least the article had the lovely title of the Black and White Squirrel Show, which was slightly dodgy, remembering the black and white minstrel show of old.
That was before my time, I just want to say.
Yeah, heaven forbid, Gill. Yeah, so, but and in that we had pictures of both grey and red white squirrels. It's quite hard to say that. And I think we had a black red squirrel. And down south there are a number of black grey squirrels. There's a little population somewhere, is it Bedfordshire, somewhere down that way, that are supposed to be more aggressive than grey squirrels, but they're still just Squirrels carolinensis, so it's the same species. But yeah, not many black squirrels actually. Some very dark squirrels, has to be said. You know, the range of coloration of red squirrels in Britain is immense. You get these right gingery, bright orange, sort of literally tangerine coloured ones, and you get some that are very grey or sandy, or some that start extremely dark in the autumn when they get their new coats, and then sort of gradually fade and get this blonde tail over the course of the year. So they do vary an enormous amount. You know, I tracked squirrels, the same ones, like 30 different ones, for 2 years round the clock. And so I was able to keep tabs of what kind of coat colour they had at various times. And you could see even the individual squirrel is not always the same colour. So yeah, very varied.
Interesting. Almost getting a kind of rainbow squirrel kind of perception from what you were saying earlier. Yeah, and I don't know how widespread. Actually, this is just a casual one that I'm chipping in, but you know, it's said that in Strathspey, for example, in colour terms, the squirrels have blonder tails very often than is normal in other parts. Is that just a local lore, or do you think that actually is a feature for, say, some of the Strathspey squirrels? It appears to be the case from my observation, but who am I to say?
Well, it's, the one time the blonde-tailed squirrel was thought to be the British subspecies. I don't know how much sort of scientific validation that has nowadays, but at any rate, you know, it was meant to be the typical squirrel of Britain. The tails went blonde over the summer. They started black, and then gradually went blonde. And but we've had so many additions to the red squirrels brought in from, I don't know, places like Denmark or Germany or what have you. So we now have a bit more of a range. But I would say, you know, whenever I visit that sort of a Boat of Garden and places like that, the predominant type of squirrel is the blonde-tailed one. So maybe they just hung on better there. The one thing I would say is that we are getting reports occasionally of very grey-looking squirrels in sort of Boat of Garden-y area, that Aviemore, that sort of area. And it is looking like they might just be very grey red squirrels. So, you know, if people see them, please get a photograph. We need to see.
Absolutely, but it's a fascinating subject in its own right, because, you know, I'm certainly one of the people that thinks maybe the native race didn't die out entirely in Strathspey, just like there's some evidence that the same applies to ospreys, that there could have been occasional breeding, you know, in the 1930s, for example, there that went unrecorded. So, but again, just lighting up things in my own interest that could lead us off down here. So getting back with a thump to reality, there's a question for Nicole. wondering whether there have been any examples of vandalism of boxes, and whether that would be a concern with providing accurate location information.
So I think the conservation officers might be able to correct me if I'm wrong in this in the chat, because I don't deal with vandalised boxes, but I know that some of the feeder boxes can be stolen or vandalised. But any samples that have been collected from that box would have the grid reference of that box, so it wouldn't impact the validity of the location at all. For our tetrad surveys, say if a box was vandalised or stolen, they would just put up a new box somewhere else within that tetrad to replace it. So again, the location data is not lost or not really affected by vandalism.
That's good to know. Question here, thinking of Fife, which, you know, on one of the maps that was shared a few minutes back, Fife is quite prominent as maybe holding a quite an interesting geographical position relative to the Central Belt greys and the Highland line. So would grey control ever be extended to Fife or the Central Belt? I don't know who wants to take this one. Again, it's maybe more Mel, but
I would love that we could afford to do control in Fife, because you kind of feel it's a peninsula. It really ought to be doable to clear Fife of grey squirrels. Having said that, it's also quite an interesting study site, I think, because one of the really earliest places that grey squirrels were introduced was in Dunfermline, and the big park there, whose name I've now forgotten. You know, they've been there for ages and ages. They spread it over quite a lot of the area of Fife, but not at the expense of red squirrels. Red squirrels are still pretty much everywhere, and just in the last couple of years, maybe even, we've seen colonization from sort of Kincardine Bridge kind of area where they used to be in the one of the big forests there. I've got name blindness, I can't remember the name of it now. But they're beginning to turn up at places like Dalgety Bay, which is, you know, just the last place you'd think to find red squirrels, but they are there and they seem to be repeatedly being seen. So red squirrels are somehow managing to hold on. And why is that? Why are they doing so well in Fife without, I mean, there are people who have controlled in the past and probably still do now, but, you know, it's hard to know whether that's the reason. Is it something to do with pine martens? I really don't know. It's an interesting problem, and I'd love to get to the bottom of it, because if we could replicate that, you know, that would help, wouldn't it?
Absolutely, yeah. And, it's fascinating because a lot of scope for future research, and I'm not really aware of Fife being particularly a hub for martens, for example. So I wonder.
No, me neither.
Yeah, is going on really. Eileen, I think there's 2 or 3 actually coming up that are really in your park here. The first one is, would the proposed changes to the Wildlife and Countryside Act have an effect on future projects? For example, if red squirrels, which may be unlikely, lost protected status?
I think no is the short answer there, Kenny. I don't think we would be advocating or tolerating any change to the legal status of red squirrels that, you know, that changed our ability to protect them. So no, that's absolutely. I mean, the changes to the Wildlife and Countryside Act, I think ultimately will be relatively minor. That they're more on the kind of, you know, species that you know, are on the periphery of you know, being in Scotland. We are not looking at any changes to anything significant, and certainly red squirrels is not on the horizon, so no need to worry there.
I think in terms of PR, etc., there would be quite a lot of howls of outrage across Britain if red squirrels
Absolutely.
were removed from special status. Wearing your kind of climate change nature hat here, something saying, with the commitments from COP26 to do more to stop and reverse the declines in biodiversity, could there be funding opportunities for grey squirrel control and funding for SSRS? Probably not enough information on this from government yet, but worth keeping a close eye on. It's, you know, quite a general question, and obviously we've talked a wee bit about funding here, and I know you wouldn't be able to sign a blank check on the air today, from NatureScot, but I just wonder whether you've got some general thoughts there.
I mean, I think it's been really important, the COP, the climate change COP, and we have the biodiversity COP coming up in April. I think they've given a prominence, and I think what's been really important is that we are beginning to, I think, get an understanding that the climate change and the biodiversity crisis are intimately linked, and we can't address one without tackling both of them. So I think that the sort of political kind of movement now gets that, and we are seeing more support and more funding being invested in biodiversity, and there's been a substantial commitment now from the Scottish Government to invest in a longer term programme, a nature restoration fund, multiple years, and so we're expecting to have a fairly substantial grant funding which will be rolling out before Christmas, which I think is really exciting. But coming back to what sort of Mel said in her talk, ideally we want to move away from this grant funding kind of regime where we have time limited pots where we establish a programme of work and volunteers, but we don't know the longer term kind of certainty, and sustainability is really where we need to be. So I think that the best opportunity for us is in relation to the Scottish Biodiversity Strategy, which will be created or revised, rewritten next year. And I think we hope, and I would certainly expect, invasive non-native species and our core iconic species like red squirrels being at the heart of that. The government wants to see our native woodland protected, not just protected, but restored. I think we're seeing a slightly more ambitious mood coming from our politicians, and obviously the Greens coming into government, I think, give us a slightly different political dynamic. So I think there are sort of promising signs, but I mean, there's a long way to go to translate that into funding commitments. And I think where the critical kind of discussion will be is to what extent do we rely on project funding, to what extent do we rely on volunteers, and to what extent do we expect land managers to do some of this work as part of the support they get. I mean, we are seeing in England now, they are establishing an agricultural support system which is built around delivering public benefits alongside and with food as a companion kind of model, and I expect that's the direction of travel, and we're obviously hopeful that'll be the direction of travel we'll go into Scotland. So there's going to be some really interesting discussions, I think, around that kind of model of to what extent do you regulate and incentivize land managers as providing some kind of core activity which you can then build on with volunteer effort, and then some project kind of central support. So I think that would be the model that ideally we would want to move into, but I think there's some discussions to be had to how we get there.
And in terms of change and different things and discussions, someone's wondering how they could get, what is the scope for wider public involvement with consultation about change?
Yeah, there will be opportunities next year because the Scottish Biodiversity Strategy will go out for public consultation. But ahead of that, there are already discussions happening with Scottish Wildlife Trust, with the environmental NGOs. So they are already inputting into discussions about what does success look like? What do we want our nature, our environment to look like in 20 years, 50 years? So I think it's important that, you have spokespeople here who are, well informed, and people like Joe who can feed into that narrative and get some kind of good grounding in the strategy to start with. But then when it goes out for wider consultation, I would absolutely advocate and encourage everybody to get involved. And if you don't think there's enough prominence, or we're not being ambitious enough, then tell us, because it's really important that we get that right.
Thanks. Next one, for Nicole, someone wondering why sightings from local record centres aren't shown on the hub.
Simply because we don't have permission. So a lot of the groups and record centres that send us their records, they've collected them from a lot of individuals, so they're volunteers, members of the public, and when they submit those records to those groups, they're not given permission for those groups to then have them on our hub website. It's just like we don't have permission for anyone putting sightings on our hub to go and give them to any, Joe Blogg's website. And collecting all those permissions would be such a feat. But also the sightings on the hub, they're really representative of the distributions as it is. And having all these extra sightings put on, it wouldn't really give us any added benefit anyway.
Yeah, thanks. And another one for yourself there, Nicole.
As well, for
sorry.
the people that we engage, sorry, as an engagement tool that we use to engage with other people, having the sightings shown and having our little totalizer thing to say, well, how many sightings have we got to this year as opposed to last year? You know, it's an engagement thing as well as just the recording device. But we do still manage the Scottish Squirrel database, so we still do have access to the whole data set.
Yeah.
Thanks. Another, keeping Nicole on the spot here, do people's personal data get uploaded to the National Biodiversity Network?
Only the person's name. So if you're the person who submitted the records to us, your name goes up as the recorder. And if you're the person that verified the record, your name goes up as verifier. But that's it, no contact details, nothing else, just your name as either recorder or verifier.
Thanks. And Rosalie had major demonstrations of the power of volunteer effort, both today in the presentations and yesterday. And it's really at the heart of this gathering in many ways. But Gill, somebody's wondering, you know, a pretty big question, and I'm sure there might be several ways that you could think about this, but you know, what do you reckon are the greatest challenges to engaging volunteers?
That's a big question. Well, I think if you're thinking in terms of recruiting volunteers, so getting them on board in the first place, John Ray talked about this morning, just the fact that a lot of the areas we were trying to get volunteers are a bit more sparsely populated, so that in itself can pose a challenge. There's just not as many people where we need them to be. Yeah, and then I guess other as well in terms of recruitment and stuff, it's actually a lot of work. You know, we've kind of like to set up these volunteer groups in particular, we kind of go through a sort of journey. Usually, you know, if we're targeting an area, we'll start off maybe doing some sort of like, you know, stalls at local fairs, kind of just generally getting our name out there, getting all that branding stuff I was talking about, getting it recognised in the community. Then we'll organise usually a kind of very general public talk that's open to everyone to come along, learn more about red squirrels, what we're doing. Hopefully from that get a few people giving us their contact details at the end. From that, then, you know, that's when, you know, our like community engagement officers, Sarah and Juliana, just do there's so much work involved, and then organising a get together, trying to figure out what skills people have got, what's missing, what do we need to advertise for, putting stuff on Facebook, you know, adverts in the local paper. It's a huge amount of work to even get to the point where we've got the beginnings of a volunteer group, and then, you know, over this 5 years, working with those groups to, you know, get them to the point where they can then start to manage themselves, and, you know, all the amazing stuff Peter was talking about this morning, like doing their own fundraising, organising their own events and stuff. It's a lot of time and effort invested into it. So I would say that in itself is the biggest challenge. But then once you've kind of got those volunteers on board, I just think things like communication are really important, making sure that they are kept up to date with what's happening and they feel engaged, they feel that their work is valued, and also I think making them realise that what they're doing is making a difference. I think that's where the hub comes in. You know, if you're just, you know, got a trap in your garden and, you know, in Aberdeen, and you're, you know, phoning someone up that comes and takes care of it, James or whoever, and you might think that what you're doing is an absolute drop in the ocean. Or if you're just someone that goes out once a year and collects some sticky tabs of hair from a feeder box, but, you know, by going onto the hub and being able to see all those amazing maps that we've been looking at over the past couple of days, and seeing that your little, what might feel like a drop in the ocean, is actually part of a much bigger picture and is really having an impact. So I think being able to show that, making that information so much more accessible to our volunteers, I hope has really helped to keep them motivated, and they'll continue to do in the future.
Absolutely, because as you've described so well there, just the various challenges are enormous, but if you can make people feel part of, you know, a nationwide picture, in some ways quite literally through the sorts of mapping that's now possible, then hopefully that helps to buoy people up. And I'm very aware also that the amount of volunteer effort, well, we're talking now, you know, with work in the south beginning in, was it back in 2001, you know, in some ways, then you're talking about decades of commitment from certain individuals, I'm sure, have been involved from practically that entire time. So, no, all power to everyone's elbow that way. We're coming to the closing minutes, but we'll try and squeeze in 2 or 3 more if we can. It's quite a sort of technical one here saying, are the recently published Scottish Forestry commissioned models regarding future strongholds for red squirrels incorporated into strategic planning for SSRS? And would there be a possibility for finding funding that word again to employ the modelers to include pine martens and make the models more realistic for the long term? I guess this is a kind of Nicole Mel type of question, really. I don't know, Nicole, do you want to say? Or Mel?
I think probably to start with, the modelling work that's been done, there's actually been various different models that have been run on identifying strongholds for red squirrels. And what tends to happen is that the majority of the best places where the red squirrels are most secure are somewhere out in Wester Ross, or it's somewhere fairly far flung where there are no grey squirrels anywhere near, and that's what makes them better in a sense. We have 2 strongholds in the current sort of fleet of strongholds that Forestry Commission identified, or should I say Scottish Forestry. One is the Fleet Basin, which does have grey squirrels amongst it, and the other one is Eskdale Muir, which is in between the borders in southwest Scotland, and that is sort of that's commercial forestry really, and that's probably the reason why it doesn't have many grey squirrels. So those are the ones that we operate anywhere near. Most of our work is about grey squirrels, and so these strongholds are kind of a backstop in a way, in case all goes pear-shaped with the grey squirrel control, and we've got these backstops, but they aren't set in stone. Even these sort of natural strongholds that Peter Lurtz was talking about, although I must say I contest the word natural, because they're all commercial forestry species, they're not actually native species, so natural, but they might get joined up, particularly with this push at the moment to increase our carbon capture through forestry planting. They might not be isolated anymore. They might get joined up by, and there's a lot of work on landscape scale restoration of native woodland. So in the future, you've got to sort of bear in mind the whole landscape, really.
Yeah, absolutely. Nicole, do you want to add anything to that? And then there's a couple of questions for you, and I think then we'll probably.
I've got nothing to add to that, Kenny. No, thanks.
Yeah, there's been
probably
a general.
Just comment on the pine marten bit of it. The pine marten would be, yes, please, let's have pine marten modelled into things, because we've got a conundrum about why in the central lowlands has squirrel pox not spread zooming up, to the Highland line in the way that it did in South Scotland. It doesn't make any sense to me. Is pine martens the answer? Don't know.
Well, and I think that probably overlaps. It's not really a question that I'll put to you, but the Fife Red Squirrel Group is obviously very intrigued by some of the mention of Fife before, and obviously would be welcoming further work on a variety of bases. And Fife Southwest, the current project area, but they do benefit from being members of the community hub. So I think Fife is basically keen to join in. I will kind of draw things to a conclusion, but I'll say with Nicole, somebody was asking when you're going to go live with the super admin role. You're going to change your clothing, come out of a phone box and fly over Scotland.
Well, thankfully the testing has actually just been completed on the super admin role. So potentially next week that we'll be going live with that, with a lot of the other updates you heard about. But you need to bear with me because I need to update all the volunteer manuals, and I need to put data agreements in place for our super admins as well before we give them that role. So it's before Christmas, not too far away. We're just about there.
Thanks. And the final one will be on somebody. I think we answered that earlier about review of the Wildlife and Countryside Act, and and Squirrels. So the very final one, question-wise, is do you know, Nicole, what the time lag is between records reaching SSRS and them being available to see on the National Biodiversity Network?
So we only upload to the NBN once a year. So in the second quarter, we'll get in touch with all the local record centres and try and get their data in. And some of them want us to upload to the NBN with our data set. So at the start of the year, we start this collection process of the data, and it all gets QC'd and reviewed. And then it's usually around September time, it will be uploaded like a complete replacement data set for the last one. So it's once per year, and up to that point, it will all be up until September of each year, it'll all be included. So yeah, it can be up to a year's lag or missing all data from that date from the last September. Or when you go onto the NBN, you can see when the data set was last uploaded or refreshed.
Okay, great. And I think just in this session, there's been a lot of food for thought, and I'd just like to thank all the panelists here for putting up with my trying to lead us off down various squirrel paths that weren't always on the main questions, but I hope the questioners and the people that were voting for those questions will also be happy with what they've heard. It's been a pleasure for me, and I should have said at the start, I'm former chair of the Scottish Wildlife Trust Conservation Committee and still sit on it, as well as, like the whole bunch of us here, a lifelong squirrel enthusiast. So thanks to all the panelists, and I see Joe Pike has popped up with an amazing backdrop. I'm also finding Zoom backdrop envy, actually. I've got an old operating system on my Mac here, and it won't cope with all these kind of beautiful backdrops that everyone else has produced. So I think it's absolutely time to switch over to someone with a much better backdrop than I've got this afternoon. So thanks to all the panelists, and welcome to Joe Pike.